Hello everyone, what is up? And welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host of Killer Instinct. And before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You are not going to want to miss it. And we also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well. So make sure you are subscribed. And if you're looking for more exclusive Killer Instinct content, you can always find that over on our Patreon. That link is always in the description box below. And if you're a Spotify listener, you can find those videos embedded through the feed or at the top of the podcast page. Now, before we jump into today's episode, I do have an exciting announcement to share with you guys. If you're a Patreon listener, you already know what I'm about to say. However, for those who do not, I do want to let you guys know that I will be attending VidCon this year. If you don't know, VidCon is a convention that is held every year, every summer in Anaheim, California. It's for content creators and YouTubers, and I attended this about 5 years ago in the very beginning of me starting out on YouTube, and it was more so for my lifestyle content. So I'm very excited to go and attend this year as well. And I'm even more excited because while I am there, I am going to be performing a live podcast of Killer Instinct. We are going to be doing this on Friday, June 20th. So if you are there or you want to stop by while you're there, that's where I'll be. That's where you can find me. I will be putting on a live podcast episode Friday, June 20th in Anaheim at VidCon. And I wanted to open up the discussion, as I have on Patreon as well, to ask you guys if there was any episode you wanted to hear or see during that live podcast, because that is also going to be recorded and uploaded for you guys as well. It is going to turn into its own episode. So opening up the discussion for any and all case requests, I will take a look at all of them. Now, with all of that being said, let's talk about why we are here today. As you guys can tell by the title of today's episode, today we are talking about a case that has captivated the nation for years. This is a case that I have always had my eye on over the past 2-ish years or so. However, I always was waiting for the right time to bring it to you guys. I was always watching and researching behind the scenes, waiting for the right time to talk to you guys about this case. And I do believe that now is a very good time to do that because we are in preparation for this case eventually going to trial. We do not have a trial date set. However, this case will more than likely be going to trial. And I did want to come to you guys with this case. That way, if you are somewhat familiar with it but want more information, or you want to know more before trial proceedings get started, you want to be able to keep up with the trial. Also, I just wanted to shed light on the victims in this case. I think that a lot of times with these bigger name cases, some of the names of the victims oftentimes get left in the shadows, and I do want to give them their light as well. So with that being said, as you can tell by the title, today we are talking about the case of the Long Island serial killer, or otherwise known as the Gilgo Beach murders, or otherwise known as a man named Rex Heuermann. So let's jump right on into it. So to start out this case, let's talk about the location that we are going to be talking about. And as you can tell by the title, this case takes place in Long Island, New York. Now, Long Island, for those who are not familiar, is home to about 8 million people, and it's an island along New York State. You have New York City on one side of Long Island and the Hamptons on the other. Now, on Long Island is also an area called Gilgo Beach. Gilgo Beach is located on the south shore of Long Island in Suffolk County, and it is also just south of Ocean Parkway, which is a scenic highway alongside the south shore of Long Island. And I'm giving you this preface because we are going to be mentioning these names a lot, and I just want to give you a little bit of an understanding of what we're talking about. Now, to really understand how we got here, it is important to talk about what is believed to really be the catalyst in this investigation, and that was the murder of a woman named Shannan Gilbert. Shannan Gilbert was born on October 24th, 1986 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania to her mother, Mary Gilbert. Shannan disappeared in May of 2010, and at the time of her disappearance, she was living in Jersey City. Now, on April 30th, 2010, Shannan left her home and went to Manhattan to meet up with a man named Michael Pack. Now, Michael Pack was a friend of hers, but was also her driver. Shannan was a sex worker. She would put out ads on Craigslist, and her and Michael would get together. Michael would drive her around to visit her different clients. He would wait for her, drive her from point A to point B. Like I said, they did have a friendship, and on the specific night, April 30th, it wasn't a relatively busy night, but around midnight is when things changed. Around midnight, Shannan got a phone call from a consistent client of hers named Joseph Brewer. Now, Joe Brewer lived out in Oak Beach, Long Island. Now, this specific neighborhood was a gated community, and it was about a 90-minute drive from where Shannan and Michael were in Manhattan, but Joe Brewer claimed that it would be worth their while. He would pay Shannan for several hours, so Shannan and Michael decided to go. They made the drive over there, and once they arrived, Shannan went inside, and Michael allegedly waited outside in the car. It wasn't until a few hours later, around 4 a.m., when Joe went outside and knocked on Michael's car window to tell him that Shannan was acting bizarre. Joe said that he was asking Shannan to leave, and she wouldn't. She seemed very paranoid, and Joe was just trying to get Michael to help aid him in getting Shannan out of the house. Now, Michael seemed confused. This wasn't typical Shannan behavior, so he walked inside and told Shannan that it was time to go and that he would drive her home. However, according to Michael, he said, again, Shannan seemed very paranoid, skittish, and scared. She kept repeating that something bad was going to happen to her. Now, both Michael and Joe tried to get Shannan out of the house. At one point, it was said that Joe grabbed Shannan by her arm to try and maneuver her out of the home. And that is when Michael said that Shannan got spooked. She started freaking out and she ran out of Joe's home. Now, we know that there is some sort of truth to this. We know that she did run out of Joe's home because there were multiple neighbors who heard Shannan running down the street. She was banging on neighbors' doors, and multiple neighbors of Joe Brewer called 911 to report the disturbance. Now, there was even one man who let Shannan in his home while he was on the phone with 911, and in the recording, you can hear Shannan pleading with this man, asking him to help her. She's saying, "I need help, there's something wrong," and it was then that the man told her to stay right there and that the police were on the way. He told her, "Just sit down, don't move, police are coming." However, right when he mentioned that the police would be arriving, Shannan seemingly got very paranoid again, and she ran out the back door. Now, according to Michael, Shannan's friend, he said that he tried to look for Shannan. He was walking around the area, driving around the area. However, after a while of not being able to locate her, he then decided to just head back home. Now, very shortly after this, police did show up. However, they were also unable to locate Shannan. But by the time the police arrived, Michael had already left. So Michael was gone and he left without Shannan. But when police arrived and Michael wasn't there and no one else really had an explanation as to where Shannan could have gone, it was presumed that Michael took Shannan home. It was presumed that because Michael went there with Shannan and Michael was no longer there, that Michael must have found Shannan and taken her home. However, that was not the case. Now, clearly, something set Shannan off that night. There was something that happened that freaked her out. However, what that was has never been clear. And there have been a lot of questions and a lot of fingers pointed at Joe Brewer and at Michael Pack. Polygraph examinations were given to both Michael and Joe. However, it came back that both of them were telling the truth. They both passed the polygraph examination. In regards to having any knowledge of what happened to Shannan, they said they did not, and they passed that polygraph examination. exam. Now, Joe did allow cops to look in his car, look in his backyard, look in his house, but nothing was found that raised any sort of suspicion or gave any evidence of foul play. However, still to this day, no one really knows what happened to Shannan that night. The only account of what we have of what happened to Shannan in the moments leading up to her disappearance comes from Joe Brewer and Michael Pack. And so those are the only two people that really know what happened in those moments. Now, Shannan's mother, Mary, when she learned about her daughter's disappearance, she was very determined to figure out what happened to Shannan. She immediately filed a missing persons report for her daughter. However, sadly, as we have seen in the past, it's not always first priority for police when a sex worker goes missing to try and figure out what happened. And so Shannan's case really did sit on the back burner for quite some time. But on December 11th of 2010, this is when this case took a turn. Several months after Shannan went missing, human remains were discovered alongside Ocean Parkway in Long Island. Now, upon discovering the remains, police were confident that they had found Shannan. They even notified Shannan's mother and told her that they believed that they found her daughter. And really, the assumption was that this was going to be an open and shut case. They found Shannan, case closed. However, Shannan had a very distinct feature about her. She actually had a titanium plate put into her jaw after a fight with an abusive ex-boyfriend that she had, but it was discovered that the remains that police found did not have that. There was no titanium plate, which is when police discovered the unthinkable. This was not Shannan, and that these remains were someone else. Now, at this point, police went back to look at that same area that they had found these remains. They went back to Ocean Parkway and they brought in cadaver dogs. It was an all hands on deck situation. And that is when they discovered an additional 3 sets of human remains. All of these remains, including the initial set of remains that was discovered that was believed to be Shannan, they were all found bound and disposed of about 1/10 of a mile away from each other alongside Ocean Parkway. So now we have 4 sets of remains, and police were able to determine that all 4 remains were all women. These 4 women, these 4 bodies that were discovered, they were then coined as the Gilgo 4. Again, Ocean Parkway is right along Gilgo Beach. So these 4 women were named the Gilgo 4. So let's talk about who the Gilgo 4 were and who police identified these women to be. The first one was a woman named Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Maureen was born on June 14th, 1982 in New London, Connecticut, and her family grew up in Norwich, Connecticut. She worked as a part-time telemarketer and also attempted to get into modeling. Maureen was a mother of 2 and trying to pave her way to set up her life for her and her children. Now, when Maureen was unable to find other employment and modeling really wasn't working out, she began working as a sex worker. Leading up to Maureen's disappearance, Maureen was served with eviction papers, and her roommate knew that they needed to try and act fast to make as much money as they can to pay for eviction court and to try and stay in her apartment. Maureen's goal at the time that she went missing was to make $3,000, and she was last seen on July 9th, 2007. Now, in July of 2007, Maureen was in New York with a friend of hers named Sarah. Sarah was also a sex worker. Her and Maureen were very close friends. They created this really strong bond, and Maureen and Sarah were working together in the days leading up to July 9th, 2007. Now, on July 9th, Sarah told Maureen that she was going to go back home. However, Maureen decided that she was going to stay in New York for another day and try and make a little bit more money. So the two of them parted ways, and Maureen stayed in Manhattan. On the night of July 9th, Maureen called Sarah and told her that she was about to meet with a client right outside of a Super 8 motel located in Manhattan. Now, shortly after Maureen's disappearance, her friend Sarah received a phone call from an unknown man on a number she did not recognize. Now, the man claimed that he had actually seen Maureen alive at a brothel in Queens. However, the man refused to identify himself and could not give the location of the brothel in question. He told Sarah that he would call back with more information, however, he never did. And Maureen was missing for several years until her body was discovered in December of 2010 alongside the north side of Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach, and she was found restrained with 3 leather belts. The second woman of the Gilgo Four is Melissa Barthelemy. Melissa was born on April 14th, 1985 in Buffalo, New York to her mother, Lynn, and her father, Mark, and she was also raised by her stepfather, Jeff. After her parents separated, Melissa lived with her mother and was said to be a very sweet girl. She was protective of her siblings, especially her younger sister, and after finishing high school, Melissa moved to Texas to live with her father, however, soon returned back to New York and began working to obtain her cosmetology license at the Continental Beauty School and began working at a local salon. In 2007, Melissa moved to the Bronx and was excited to begin a new chapter of her life. It was said while living in the Bronx that Melissa began working as a sex worker. Again, similarly to Shannan and Maureen, Melissa got a lot of her clientele off of Craigslist. She went by the alias Chloe. Now, Melissa went missing in July of 2009, and on the night that she was last seen, we know that Melissa met with the client. She also deposited $900 into her bank account, and she also attempted to call an old boyfriend of hers. However, that boyfriend did not pick up the phone. Now, in July of 2009, Melissa's family grew worried when she seemingly out of the blue just stopped returning their phone calls. Melissa was one who would check in on her family regularly. They talked very, very frequently, so it was very unlike her to not reach out. Now, 1 week after Melissa's disappearance, Melissa's 15-year-old sister Amanda began receiving a series of very unsettling and disturbing phone calls from a man who was actually using Melissa's cell phone. So these phone calls were coming from Melissa's phone. Now, the man on the other line was asking Amanda if she was quote unquote a whore like her sister. Amanda said the calls became increasingly more disturbing. One time, the man told Amanda that her sister was dead and that he was going to quote unquote watch her rot. Amanda described the voice as someone who seemed middle-aged, sounded like a white male, and police were able to trace back some of these calls to Midtown Manhattan, Madison Square Garden, as well as Massapequa, which is in Long Island. However, they were unable to determine who was making them. It seemed like they were coming from burner phones. Then, in December of 2010, similarly to Maureen, Melissa's body was discovered in a burlap sack, and her manner of death was ruled a homicide, and she was only 24 years old at the time of her murder. Believe it or not, planning meals really can be simple and stress-free. Imagine having your week of meals already decided for you with personalized options that fit your lifestyle. That's what makes Hungryroot such a game changer in my house. Hungryroot takes the stress out of mealtime by planning a full week of meals tailored to your taste, and it gets smarter with every single order. With over 15,000 quick recipes shipped each week, many ready in just 15 minutes or less, mind you, it's easy to find options that fit your whole family's tastes and nutrition goals. Whether you're gluten-free, dairy-free, high protein, focused on your gut health, or just about anything else, Hungryroot helps you stay on track. After a quick quiz, their Smart Cart technology builds a weekly menu that fits your needs. It's like having a personal meal planner who just gets it. I can't tell you guys how great it has been for me in this busy season of life to have a one-stop shop with Hungryroot and know that they have me covered with my weekly meals. It is one less thing to worry about, and I am so grateful. Hungryroot helps cut down on food waste and keeps you from defaulting to expensive takeout when time's tight. You get great value with thoughtfully planned meals, and with my offer, every delivery includes a free item. And Hungryroot holds its ingredients to a high standard, avoiding over 200 additives like high fructose corn syrup, preservatives, and artificial sweeteners. They use quality ingredients like hormone and antibiotic-free meat and seafood, organic produce, and non-GMO choices so you can feel good about what you're eating. So take advantage of this exclusive offer. For a limited time, get 40% off your first box plus a free item in every box for life. Go to hungryroot.com/killer and use code KILLER. That's hungryroot.com/killer, code KILLER to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/killer, code KILLER. The third out of the Gilgo Four is Megan Waterman. Megan was born on January 18th, 1988 in Cumberland County, Maine, to her parents, Gregory and Lorraine. She grew up alongside her older brother, Greg, and Megan's parents split up prior to her being born, and due to issues in the family, it caused for Megan and Greg to be very much in and out of the foster care system before eventually moving in with their grandmother. In 2006, Megan welcomed a daughter, and she did everything that she could to create a good life for her daughter. However, things were difficult, and her circumstances led her to getting involved in sex work. Now, similarly to the other girls, she did a lot of advertising on Craigslist, and on May 31st, 2010, Megan left her daughter with her mom and traveled to Long Island. She kept in touch for the first few days. However, the contact stopped on June 5th, 2010, and that was the last time her family ever heard from her. Her family knew that something was very wrong when Megan never came home from this specific trip. Megan was not one to just up and leave her daughter. She wouldn't have just ran off, and they feared the worst. And at the time that Megan went missing, Megan was staying at a motel 15 miles away from Gilgo Beach. And similarly to the others, her remains were found in December of 2010, and Megan was only 22 years old. Now, the last of the Gilgo Four is a woman named Amber Costello. Amber was born on February 10th, 1983 in North Carolina to her parents, Alfred and Margaret. She grew up with her sister, Kimberly, and Amber was known to be a very kind and giving person. She was always someone who was very eager to help. She had a lot of empathy for others. Amber did face hardships throughout her life, and she was sexually assaulted by a neighbor when she was 6 years old. She became addicted to drugs when she was a teenager, and at the time of her disappearance, Amber was living in West Babylon, New York, which is about 10 miles from Gilgo Beach. However, prior to this, she was living in Clearwater, Florida with her second husband and working as a waitress before divorcing him and moving to New York. Upon moving to New York is when Amber got involved with sex work. Amber went missing in September of 2010, and the night that she went missing, it was reported that she was meeting up with a client who lived in Long Island, who was offering her $2,500 for her services for just a few hours. Amber quickly agreed to meeting up with this client based off of the amount of money that she was going to be making, and the client requested that Amber leave her phone back at her hotel, which she agreed to do. Now, when Amber didn't return home, her friends grew very, very worried. One friend called Amber's sister, Kimberly, to see if she knew where Amber was. However, she did not. It was not until December 2010 that Amber's remains would be discovered again in a burlap sack on Gilgo Beach. In January 2011 is when a DNA match confirmed that the remains were in fact Amber's, and her autopsy revealed that she died due to strangulation. Now, what I want to point out is that in Amber's case in particular, because she went missing in September 2010 and her remains were discovered only a few months later, the medical examiner was able to provide a cause of death, being strangulation. The other three, on the other hand, did not have that because they had been missing for years, some of them, and so they weren't able, by they, I mean the medical examiner, was not able to determine an exact cause of death. However, they were able to determine that the manner of death for all of them was homicide. Now, in Amber's investigation, because she had left her phone at home, police were able to see that she was communicating with a burner phone that was located in central Long Island. Now, with the discovery of the Gilgo Four, police in Long Island were now on a hunt for a serial killer who appeared that they were hunting women. Based off of what police knew, they theorized that this killer was located in Long Island, and as you can imagine, the locals in the community at the time in 2010 were filled with anxiety and concerns. The FBI's behavioral analysis unit got involved in the case and gave their perception of who they believe their killer was. According to the BAU, they believed that they were looking for a white male in his 40s who was socially competent, however devious at the same time. They said it was probably someone who blended into the community and someone who could potentially be a family man. They said if they did have a family, family. More than likely, this family did not spend a lot of time at home because they believe that that is where a lot of the murders ended up taking place. Because wherever their killer was conducting these murders, he would have to carry their bodies into his car and drive them out to Gilgo Beach and dispose of the bodies. So either the kills were taking place in his vehicle or they were taking place at his home. Now, despite the discovery of the Gilgo 4, Shannan Gilbert was still missing, and police were not confident at this point that Shannan's disappearance was related to the Gilgo 4. However, 11 months after Shannan went missing, police began their search for her once again. They went back to Ocean Parkway to look for her. However, this is when they discovered more and more bodies, none of which were Shannan Gilbert. Police were stunned at this point, and they were collectively up to 10 sets of human remains that were being recovered, including the Gilgo 4, all unsolved, and like I said, none of which were Shannan. The remains found in 2011 were the victims as follows. Jessica Taylor, her torso had been discovered in actually 2003 in Manorville, Long Island, which is about 50 miles away from Gilgo Beach. The remainder of her body was discovered in 2011 at Gilgo Beach. She was living in Manhattan at the time that she went missing on July 21st, 2003, and the circumstances of her disappearance were very similar to the Gilgo 4. Jessica lived locally in Long Island, however, she was working in New York as a sex worker at the time of her disappearance. Only 5 days after she went missing on July 26th of 2003 is when her torso was discovered. It was found on top of a pile of wood at the end of a paved road, and like I mentioned, the rest of her remains were discovered in March of 2011, so her skull, hands, and forearms. So Jessica Taylor had been completely dismembered. Now, the other set of remains that were discovered were named Jane Doe number 6. Now, Jane Doe number 6 was later identified as a woman named Valerie Mack. Now, Valerie Mack also was known as Melissa Taylor. She was living in Philadelphia at the time of her murder and was working as a sex worker when she went missing in the year 2000. She was last seen in the summer of 2000 by a friend of hers in Port Republic, New Jersey. She was in and out of the foster care system from a very young age, and she was actually never reported as missing. She was a mother to a young son, and Valerie's partial remains were discovered in November of 2000 when her torso was found in garbage bags in Manorville as well. So Valerie Mack's torso and Jessica Taylor's torso were found in the same area, and her other set of remains, so her head, her right foot, and her hands were discovered in April 2011 near Gilgo Beach on Ocean Parkway, and she was named Jane Doe number 6 until she was able to be identified. Now, buried 250 feet away from Valerie was our next victim, Tatiana Dykes. Tatiana was born in Texas on March 17th, 1995, and she was the only body that was discovered that was a child. Tatiana was a toddler at the time that she was killed, and she was believed to have been killed when she was only 2 years old. Her body was found wrapped in a blanket, however, with no visible signs of trauma. A DNA test determined that her mother was named Tanya Jackson, who was also buried right next to her. Tanya Jackson, who was known as Jane Doe number 3 for quite some time, was born on October 22nd, 1970 in Alabama, and she was living in Brooklyn, New York at the time that she went missing in 1997. Tanya served in the Army from 1993 to 1995, and she was said to have had an estranged relationship with her family, so she was never reported missing. In June of 1997, Tanya's dismembered torso was also discovered at Hampstead Lake State Park, which is located in Lakeview. Her torso was discovered in a green Rubbermaid plastic container, and initially police were not able to identify Tanya, obviously because they only had her torso and they were not able to collect a DNA profile. However, it was in April of 2011 when police discovered her remains alongside Ocean Parkway. In December of 2016, police were finally able to positively identify the remains as belonging to Tanya Jackson, and she was buried next to her daughter, Tatiana. Now, these next set of remains that were discovered alongside Ocean Parkway were actually male remains, and these remains have been coined as Asian doe. Now, the remains that were found, they had male organs. However, they were dressed in clothes that were female clothes. So police theorized that potentially this man was dressing in drag or possibly identified as a female. He was dressed in women's clothing, and forensics anthropologists concluded that this male was most likely an Asian male in his late teens to early 20s. It was determined that he died from injuries caused by blunt force trauma, and his remains were discovered in April of 2011, and the anthropologists were able to determine that he had been dead for anywhere between 5 to 10 years. So those are the identities of the next set of remains that were discovered in that area, but I want to pull our focus back to Shannan Gilbert for a moment, because months and months were passing and police were not able to locate her. But interestingly enough, there was a marsh area in Oak Beach, which was the same neighborhood that Shannan went missing where she was last seen, that authorities were not searching in. And they claimed that they were not searching because the conditions of the marsh were dangerous, it was wet, the brush was taller than the average person, they didn't believe that Shannan was there, it was too difficult to see through. They had excuses after excuses, and many people were questioning why they were not looking there. They were criticizing the fact that police weren't searching there because this very well could be where her remains were, where her body was. And it was finally in December of 2011 when police did search that marsh that they discovered Shannan's remains. Shannan's body was discovered about a half mile away from where she was last seen. Now, initially, police were claiming that Shannan's death was accidental, which was very surprising and shocking given everything else that was going on. Given all of the other remains that were discovered, police claimed that they believed that Shannan drowned in the marsh that she was found in. When Shannan's body was discovered, she was found without her jeans on, which people believed could be evidence of foul play. And it made a lot of people even more confident that Shannan was murdered. However, police claimed that they believed that Shannan removing her pants would have been a result of paradoxical hypothermia, which is where people in late stages of hypothermia become so cold that their body actually tricks them into thinking they're overheating, so they strip their clothes off. And they believe that that makes more sense. Shannan's body, like I said, was discovered not only a half a mile from where she was last seen. For all that time, she was just half a mile away from where she was last seen, but she was also discovered only half a mile away from where the Gilgo 4 and all the other bodies were recovered. But despite this, the medical examiner concluded that the manner of death was undetermined. Now, for years, all of these cases went unsolved, and a big reason for that, and really the main reason for that, was because of the Suffolk County Police Department at that time. And the Suffolk County Police Department has been heavily criticized for the way that they conducted this investigation. They've been criticized for the delay and the lack of transparency. There has been accusations of obstructing the investigation by former Suffolk County Chief named James Burke, who blocked the FBI from having any involvement in the case and was not allowing any outside agencies from aiding in the investigation. Now, there was evidence that was not shared between the Suffolk County Police Department, the FBI, and the state police, which obviously caused massive delays. So the evidence that the Suffolk County Police Department had at that time was not being shared with the FBI or with other state police, which obviously caused massive delays in this case. Now, eventually, James Burke was sentenced to 46 months in prison after he beat up another suspect in a different case and was orchestrating a cover-up. This man that he beat up was named Christopher Loeb, and Christopher Loeb was arrested for carjacking. Christopher was breaking into other people's cars, and he unknowingly broke into Chief Burke's car. Now, in Chief Burke's car, he stole a black bag, and inside of that black bag had leather belts, pornography, sex toys, just things that didn't really look good for the chief of police to have. Now, Christopher was immediately brought in for questioning, and while he was being interrogated in the interrogation room, that is when Chief Burke went into the room and allegedly beat him up. He completely fought him, and he was actually charged with it. Like I said, he was charged and sentenced to 46 months in prison, and then in the day following James Burke being indicted, the FBI had officially rejoined the investigation. Now, the FBI definitely tried to assist anywhere they could in this case. However, it was still hard for them due to the lack of management and disorganization in this case up until that point. So it wasn't like they were coming in and everything was organized for them and ready for them to go. They still had to clean up the mess that was this investigation up until this point. Now, between the years of 2016 and 2022, there really were no massive updates in this case. There were no significant breakthroughs, and police were still working the case. However, there were no arrests that had been made or anything that was released to the public, but that was until May of 2022 when Shannan Gilbert's 23-minute 911 call was released to the public. Now, this was crucial. This 911 call being released was a very, very big deal because up until this point, police were trying to argue that Shannan's case was accidental, that her death was accidental. However, all of the other evidence was proving otherwise, and this 911 call definitely emphasized that foul play was seemingly involved in her case. In this call, you can hear Shannan fearing for her life. The call took place from Shannan's phone to the Suffolk County 911 Dispatch Center at 4:51 a.m. on May 1st, 2010. In the call, Shannan stated that she was at the home of her client, Joseph Brewer, in Oak Beach, Long Island. During this phone call, Shannan sounded panicked, and there was a lot of scuffing sounds. It seemed like she was running, trying to get away. She was whispering, and you can hear Shannan saying, "They're trying to kill me and help me." She also mentioned Michael Pack in the phone call, and at one point in the call, Shannan ran out of Joseph's house, and this is when she began banging on neighbors' doors for help, as I had previously mentioned. Now, the reason that this call was so pivotal in the investigation is, like I said, for years, police were trying to convince everyone that Shannan died from an accidental drowning in the marsh that she was found in. But this 911 call contradicted the idea that Shannan was just out of it and, oh, she must have just stumbled into this marsh and into this brush and just died, and that it was a fault of her own. This completely contradicts all of that. Now, I do want to mention the only other real solid person of interest that police looked into in this case, and that was a man named John Bitrolf. Now, in July of 2014, John was arrested in Suffolk County for the murders of two women. Those women were Rita Tangretti and Colleen McNamee. Now, both of these women were sex workers who were murdered in the 90s, and it wasn't until 2014 when DNA technology was able to confirm John's DNA was found on both of those women's bodies, both Rita and Colleen's. It was actually genealogy that connected John to this case, as his brother had given DNA in 2013 for an unrelated case, and through that, police were able to narrow down John as their suspect in Rita and Colleen's murders. He also became the prime suspect in the murder of a woman whose body was discovered in a similar area to some of the other victims that we talked about in Manorville, and that woman was named Sandra Castilla. Now, Sandra Castilla was born on August 25th, 1965 in Trinidad to her parents, Ramke and Molly. Her father was a police officer, and Sandra grew up looking up to him and being inspired by his work to serve his community. Sandra grew up alongside her brother, and the family of four seemed to live a very happy life until 1972, when sadly Sandra tragically lost both of her parents, leaving her and her brother to really fend for themselves and try and navigate life without the guidance of their parents. When Sandra was 19 years old, she married a man in Hawaii, which allowed her to move to the United States, and she eventually divorced him and relocated to New York for a fresh start to try and reestablish herself. However, sadly, she would never get the chance. On November 21st, 1993, there were two hunters who stumbled upon human remains in a wooded area of North Sea, Southampton, which is about 60 miles away from Gilgo Beach. These hunters notified police, who arrived on the scene, and through fingerprints, police were able to reveal that the remains belonged to Sandra. Sandra had her fingerprints in the system after an arrest in 1992 after she tried to jump a subway turnstile. An autopsy revealed that Sandra had been strangled to death and that there were also signs of sexual assault, and she was 28 years old at the time of her death. Now, the investigation of finding Sandra's killer was not an easy one. Initially, there were no viable suspects, but police were able to determine that Sandra was working as a sex worker at the time of her death, which really opened up the pool of suspects. However, they didn't really have a direction as to where to look. Now, the case ultimately did go cold, and it wasn't until 2014 when John Bittroff, who was a carpenter, was arrested, and that made police question if he could be their suspect. However, there was not enough physical evidence to connect John to the murder of Sandra, so he was not charged with her murder, leaving Sandra's case unsolved. In 2021, it was announced that the Suffolk County Police Department was welcoming a new police commissioner, and that was a man named Rodney Harrison. Rodney was determined to get to the bottom of what happened in the Gilgo Beach murders. He wanted to get to the bottom of who this killer was, and he made a promise that he was going to dedicate time and effort in order to do that. Rodney also announced that he was going to create a task force once he got into office to officially solve these murders. And alongside Rodney was the new DA in Suffolk County, which was a man named Ray Tierney. Now, the task force that Rodney had created and assigned to this case first began their meetings in February of 2022. They decided to go back through all of the archived files. Everything was digitally uploaded this time. They were going through statements and evidence and everything. And that is when they noticed something that seemingly was looked over. Amber Castillo, one of the victims, had an encounter with a man who was a client of hers. Now, there was a statement from Amber's friends regarding this specific man. The friends stated that while Amber was at this man's house one night, she had called two of her male friends to come and help her because she claimed that she didn't feel safe. Now, when her two male friends got there, they walked into the home and said that they came face to face with a 6'4" to 6'6" man who they described as an ogre. The two male friends tried to get out of the house with Amber, but the man said that Amber would not be allowed to leave unless she gave him his money back because he wanted a refund. However, one of the male friends that Amber was with threatened this specific client with his pit bull that he had in his car, and the client let them all go. Now, they were able to see upon leaving the house that this man drove a first-generation Chevy Avalanche. They also learned that the house that this man lived in was in Massapequa, Long Island. And the reason that this was important was because police also knew that the burner phones that were being used to contact these women, they were being used in Massapequa and in Midtown Manhattan. And these are when the dots were starting to connect, because police discovered that this specific client not only lived in Massapequa, however, he also worked in Manhattan. Now, like I said, the task force's first meeting was in February of 2022, and by March 14th, 2022, this is the first time that their suspect's name was brought up, and that suspect was a man named Rex Heuermann. Rex Heuermann was born on September 13th, 1963 in Massapequa Park, Long Island, to his parents, Ted and Dolores. Ted was a World War II veteran and was in the U.S. Air Force and passed away in 1975 when Rex was only 12 years old. Rex was said to have a very close relationship with his mom. A high school classmate described him as being a mama's boy and suggested that most of Rex's decisions were dictated by his mother. The relationship between Rex and his mom was described by some as unusually close, and other family members recalled going over to Rex's family home growing up and feeling like it was a very tense environment, always feeling like everyone was walking on thin ice. One cousin even reported it to be a creepy atmosphere. It was said that Rex's father was very strict prior to his death, and that Rex experienced some trauma at the hands of his father. It was said that Rex was abused by his father. Now, growing up, Rex attended Berner High School, where he graduated in 1981 and went on to attend the New York Institute of Technology, where he earned his bachelor's degree. Rex also grew up with multiple siblings. He lived on a house on First Avenue in Long Island for the entirety of his life. I want you guys to understand that. Rex lived as an adult in the same house that he grew up in. He lived in this house in Massapequa for his entire life. He lived in that house in his childhood, in his teenage years, all the way up into his adult years, up until his arrest. It was reported that he purchased the house from his mom in the 1990s, and this is where Rex and his family lived. A lot of people have questioned this because it was reported that Rex experienced a lot of trauma in this house. However, he never chose to leave as an adult. And even more than that, this house almost still stood as a time capsule for Rex. Rex never changed the home. Rex never updated the home. The house still looked exactly as it did when Rex lived there as a child. Now, in 1996, Rex married a woman named Asa Elrup. Asa is from Iceland, and the two married, like I said, in 1996. Asa had a son from a previous marriage named Christopher, and together, her and Rex had a daughter named Victoria. Now, prior to marrying Asa, Rex founded a New York-based architect group called RH Consultants and Associates, which is no longer operating. He also had very big name clientele from this group. He worked with major businesses such as Target, American Airlines, Foot Locker, and more. And the offices for his company were in Midtown Manhattan. Now, despite living in the same home for the entirety of his life, Rex was not very well known in his community. He was said to have kept to himself a lot. His family and him were more on the quiet side. He was described by neighbors as a recluse individual who kept to himself and had limited interactions with others. He was often seen by his neighbors either woodworking or washing his car. Rex also wasn't known to be the nicest of neighbors. One neighbor recalled that most people knew not to knock on Rex's door on Halloween because he was not a very pleasant person. Another neighbor recalled an incident where Rex allegedly was seen lurking over a fence while this specific neighbor's wife was tanning in the backyard. Now, based off of the neighbor's accounts, it did seem like Rex was definitely the black sheep of the neighborhood, Rex and his family, despite living there the longest. Now, when police began looking into Rex, they were able to create a full profile for him. To start out their investigation, the one thing they did was trace the activity of the burner phone data that they had. Now, when they did that, they were able to determine where these burner phones were, where they were used, what times they were used at, and lo and behold, police were able to match the data from the burner phones as almost identical to Rex's personal cell phone. What that means is that wherever these burner phones were being used, Rex was also in that location. Rex's personal cell phone picked him up in that exact same area. No matter where he was, no matter where those burner phones turned on, so did Rex's personal cell phone. Now, on May 19th, 2023, police even watched Rex walk into a store in Manhattan and pay to add minutes to a burner phone. They were able to go through Rex's email accounts and see that he was still actively inquiring escorts about their services through Craigslist, and it made police worried that if they didn't act fast, Rex was going to hurt another woman. Police wanted to obtain a DNA sample from Rex. However, they did not want him knowing that he was being followed or looked into by police out of fear that he would flee and potentially ruin their investigation. So instead, police began secretly following and surveillancing Rex, and they ended up watching him throw away a pizza box with leftover pizza inside of it. So police recovered that. Now, police already had 5 hairs that were recovered from the dismembered bodies when those bodies and remains were discovered in 2010. So the victims that we had previously spoken about, police had 5 hairs that they had recovered from those bodies. And so they were comparing those hairs to the DNA inside of the pizza box. And when they did, the forensics showed that the hairs and the DNA in the pizza box were an exact match to Rex Heuermann. The actual test result said that 99.96% of the North American population can be excluded except Rex Heuermann. Now, at this point, police had enough evidence to make an arrest, and on July 13th, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested while leaving his place of work. Police said that Rex did not seem surprised at his time of arrest. Now, initially, Rex was only charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. However, in January of 2024, he was then charged with the 4th out of the Gilgo 4, Maureen Brainard Barnes. A hair found in the buckle that was used to restrain Maureen was a match to Rex. Now, after his arrest, police did search through Rex's home. Inside of it, they found many guns, none of which they believe were actually used in the murders, but Rex did have many of them. They also recovered all of Rex's electronics inside of the house, and when looking through the electronics in the laptop, they did see that Rex tried to clear his search history. However, police were able to recover that search history and found that much of the history was consistent of the investigation surrounding the Gilgo Beach killer. Rex was searching about the victims' families, the state of the investigation, and he also had an extremely disturbing porn history on his computer that I'm just not even going to get into. On the computer, police had also recovered a file. This file is crucial. This file was created in the year 2000, and it essentially is a blueprint of how to get away with murder. Rex had created a list. He had created lists within these documents of the supplies that he would need to commit a murder. Some of this included a police scanner, medical gloves, a rope, cutting tools, photo film, hairnets, and more. He also had a list of problems that he could run into that could land him in jail, such as the DNA, bloodstains, tire marks being left behind, fingerprints inside of gloves, and much more. He also wrote down tips and tricks to remember about murders. One included: get some sleep before a hunt. Too tired creates problems. Another line he wrote: more sleep and noise control equals more playtime. He also had on this document what he needed to do after the murders. This included removing any tattoos from his victims, any torture marks, removing the head and hands of his victims, removing trace DNA, and more. Now, a lot of people questioned Rex's family in this investigation and after his arrest because they were questioning how Rex, who was this family man who lived in his house with his family, was supposedly able to get away with doing all of these things for years, and if his wife really had any knowledge of it. Now, pertaining to the three women, Melissa, Megan, and Amber, police were able to determine that Rex's family was actually out of town at the time that these women went missing, while Rex remained in Long Island. Now, a few months later, in June 2024, Rex was also indicted for the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Castillo. It turns out that there were 3 strands of hairs found on Sandra's body, and police tested Rex's DNA and found that the DNA on Sandra's body was a match to Rex. Now, Asa immediately divorced Rex following his arrest, however, continued attending his court hearings and stating that she didn't believe that he could be responsible for this, which really gave mixed messages to the public, who was wanting her to really stand her ground and show and prove that she didn't know anything about it by really disassociating herself from Rex completely. However, she didn't do that. Now, after the house had been searched by authorities, Asa and her children moved back into the family home, which really became a media circus at this point. There were people outside constantly with cell phones yelling at them. It was a whole scene. Now, in pertaining to Rex and pertaining to these murders, there are still countless unsolved murders around the time that all of these women were discovered. They have the same MO, same location as where all the other bodies were recovered, all of it. However, their cases are still unsolved, and as of now, Rex is being charged with the murder of only 7 women in total, and I say only because his presumed kill count is said to be in the triple digits, is what a lot of people are assuming at this point. But as of right now, he is being charged with the murders of Melissa, Megan, Maureen, Amber, Sandra, Jessica Taylor, and Valerie Mack. Investigators are still trying to determine if they can link Rex to the other murders, but the truth is, we will probably never know the exact amount of women that Rex has killed. Rex has pled not guilty to the charges against him, and he is currently being held at the Riverhead Correctional Facility in Suffolk County, and a trial date has not yet been set at this time, but like I mentioned in the very beginning, this is going to be a case that we follow very, very closely. But with that being said, you guys, that's this case. That's where we're at. We're going to have more information as time passes and we learn more about a trial. And I'm sure once that trial gets started, there's going to be a boatload of new information that we learn about, and we will go through it all. But I wanted to give you this for today. So with that being said, you guys, that's going to be all for me today. Definitely let me know what you think of this case in the comments below. But like I said, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I'm your host of Killer Instinct. And if you have not already, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version here on YouTube on Wednesdays as well. All the Patreon links will be in the description box below, so you can check that out if you have not already. I will be back next week with a brand new case for you guys, and until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.